नमस्कार, लोक गाथा में आपका स्वागत है। आज हमारे साथ एक बड़े ही विशेष अतिथि जुड़े हैं, जिनका नाम है डॉक्टर भास्कर कांबळे जी। डॉक्टर भास्कर कांबळे जी आज हमारे साथ उनके पुस्तक के विषय में चर्चा करने वाले हैं, जो कि गणित के ऊपर आधारित है। गणित अजय अजय पै जी का प्रिय विषय है, इसीलिए मैं यह चाहता हूँ कि इस पॉडकास्ट का फ्लो वे ही संभाले और वे ही भास्कर जी के साथ आज जो भी वार्तालाप होगा, उसी का संचालन करें। तो नमस्कार सभी को। नमस्कार भास्कर जी, धन्यवाद लोक गाथा के इस मंच पर आने के लिए। अजय भैया, आप
नमस्ते।
में आप दर्शकों को भास्कर जी का परिचय दे सकते हो।
Namaste, Vedant. Namaste, Bhaskar ji. Thank you for coming on Lokatha. So, for the viewers, mostly today we are going to talk on very interesting topics, which is probably regarded, in my opinion, as the most important cultural narrative that we should be building as a nation. Because a lot of things are said when it comes to the shaping of the cultural narrative in India, and most of it revolves around the glorification of an ancient India. And it is immediately not clear which one to accept and which one to reject out of all those things that go around. So today, that is why we have called on our channel Dr. Bhaskar Kamble ji, who has written this fantastic book. It's called The Imperishable Seed: How Hindu Mathematics Changed the World and Why This History Was Erased. So the title itself is quite curious. It made me raise my eyebrows, certainly, because mathematics and Hindu mathematics doesn't, at least in my opinion, when I did not read this book, I was very surprised. How is this possible? But then I looked into the book, and this book has been endorsed by people like H.C. Verma and Ramasubramaniam and Rajiv Malhotra. Most people know these people, know these big personalities. So I was curious. Anyway, so I got in touch with Bhaskar ji through Twitter, and we asked him if he could do this, and he kindly accepted our invitation. So first, let us talk about him a little bit. So Bhaskar ji finished his BSc in physics from Delhi University, and from there he pursued his master's and PhD in the same field from IIT Kanpur. And from there, he went on to have postdoctoral experiences in Berlin and in South Korea in theoretical physics. And now he works as a data scientist in Germany. So he's joining us currently from Berlin, if I'm not wrong. And we are very, very happy to have you, sir, on the channel. And I hope that this podcast, at least the series of podcasts that we have planned, will be a great success in churning out some really important historical facts. We are going to demolish the clutter. We are going to cut the clutter and talk about history today from you. And so to begin the discussion, maybe it would be very apt for me to show the book again and ask you about a very simple question. Mathematics as a field, I'm also in science research. You are also a PhD holder in physics. So quite naturally, my curiosity was, how did you mention Hindu in front of mathematics? That doesn't, I don't know how and why it is, why you put it there. And I was a little curious about this title. Could you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, sure. So there is, of course, this notion that mathematics is a universal subject in which all the cultures and civilizations they participate. So or people have this notion that it's a secular kind of a concept which is you know separate from religion and all those things. So what most people don't realize is that concepts like universal, secular, they all have a very specific meaning. For example, the word secular comes from a very Western perspective. It has a meaning only in the context of Western history, not the rest of the history. So the idea of secular cannot be a universal concept, in the sense that secular relates to the separation of religion from the state, because like in the West you saw that religion and scientific knowledge, they could not go hand in hand, and so they had to make this separation. Whereas in the Indian civilization, the framework of knowledge itself is such that it takes into account both the metaphysical and the material aspects of knowledge, and this is built into the framework of the Hindu knowledge systems. And so the growth of mathematics in the Hindu civilization was a direct consequence of this knowledge system, of the spiritual framework, and which for which reason I think that the word Hindu mathematics is actually an apt name. And what I also would like to also point out that if mathematics was indeed like a universal subject, then you have to remember that concepts like abstract concepts like zero, the number system, they originated in India and they took centuries to be accepted in Europe. And if they are really universal, why did they take centuries to be accepted in Europe? Then you have other things like the idea of infinity infinity in the Hindu mathematical tradition is linked to the concept of kahara, as enunciated by Bhaskara too, which so he compares it to Lord Vishnu. So no matter how many beings come into Lord Vishnu or go out of him, he remains the same. So something along those lines he has discussed. So I wanted to bring out these philosophical connections with the deeper knowledge framework, and to show that this is an outgrowth of this. What I also wanted to really point out is what I also want to really point out is that mathematics is supposedly a universal field, a discipline, but if you look at the history of historians of Western mathematics, they make it clear that it is universal, but it is Western. If you look at the statements of the, like for example, G.H. Hardy or many other people, they say very clearly, as I have also documented in my book, that Greek mathematics is the real mathematics. The other mathematics civilizations, mathematics may be intellectual curiosities, but this is the real thing. So of course, so this idea of universal mathematics is more like a way of telling the other cultures that their mathematics is deficient. So this is these are some aspects. What also I wanted to emphasize is that the Hindu is not used in the religious sense in my book. It is used more in the civilizational sense, more in a geographical sense, as it was used by the foreigners before they came to India. And in this sense, because the Hindu civilization includes also the mathematics, includes also great Jain scholars like Hemachandra and Mahavira from the ninth century. So their work is also extremely important in the development of mathematics. And so I wanted to give a common name which is independent of the Vedic religion, as we call it, Hinduism, as which is independent of Hinduism. And so I thought that the word Hindu is an appropriate name, and there are, like some people have been asserting that I should have called it Vedic mathematics, but or because of this very reason, I think Vedic mathematics is a misleading term. So I did not want to call it that, because it's a wrong term when you consider other cultures and other streams of thought, Buddhist, Jain streams of thought. Then this is other option for calling it Indian mathematics, to specify the mathematics in the Indian civilization. But this again I found it very problematic, because the word India refers to a distinct political entity which was created in 1947, and whose physical boundaries are also well determined today. So a lot of areas which formerly belonged to the Hindu civilization, like for example Pakistan in the west, or Bangladesh in the east, or even places like Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Thailand, they all come together in the yeah in the ages of the Hindu civilization. So for example, the Ramayana is still a very popular text in Thailand. Cambodia has the Angkor Wat temple. Then you had this famous mathematical manuscript called the Bakshali manuscript, that was found in a place which is today in Pakistan. Then the Takshashila University was formerly part of Pakistan. So so like for out of this reason, I thought even the term Indian mathematics is misleading. So these are some of the reasons why I made me decide that Hindu mathematics is the perfect term for describing this. Mhm.
Wow, that was that was fantastic. I just thought that I can just keep listening to you and you would just keep talking. But it's a podcast and we have to move on. Let's move on to the next question. So you said a lot. It was probably a fantastic extempore. You keep talking about, were you always of this mindset, when did this curiosity begin in you? Because you have a PhD in theoretical physics, you have a you've been all around the world. What prompted you? Was there anything that motivated you, probably in your upbringing or your childhood, to do all this? Or was it later in life that you realized, oh no, this is something that I have to focus on? Or how did this happen? How did you end up writing this book with such secular credentials?
Yeah, this is actually a very also an interesting story. I mean, I've also written this, described this in my book. For example, I was, pretty, from a very, English medium school, one of the top tier schools in New Delhi. I studied there, and in fact, so and yeah, and my notion of the Hindu civilization was actually, like the popular notion is prevalent amongst India's intelligentsia, that it's full of superstitions. The Hindu civilization is full of superstitions. It is full of caste discrimination. This was the, like, mainly the only thing I knew about the Hindu civilization. I knew that, okay, there was some sort of, the Gupta age or some such things which I had read in history in my during school, but then that was it. Predominantly it was a negative, like, picture for me, the Hindu civilization. So I sort of, carried out with these notions. Then but somehow, yeah, in when I was in IIT Kanpur, one of my friends mentioned to me that, that, this Pythagoras theorem, which we call the Pythagoras theorem, it is to be found in the, Baudhayana Sulba Sutras. And this was sometime in, I think, 2007 or something. It must have been at that time. And that time you did not have so much internet knowledge. On internet was not there and everything. So, like this, I kind of, thought that he's just, like talking through his hat. It is basically just some sort of a, Hindu right wing nationalist things. They want to just put everything, they want to show that everything comes from India, this sort of thing. I did not take it really very seriously at all. But funnily enough, a few years during that time also, I was being very much interested in in learning more about Indian philosophy at the same time, independent of this, these notions of Hindu nationalism, which I thought, characterizes and the discourse of India. So I was reading a lot of, Bhagavad Gita at that time. And so, in fact, I read this book in Hindi, on the commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, called by Swami Ram Sukhdas, called Sadhak Sanjeevani. It's a huge book, and it was really, for me, a life changing experience. And I learned a lot from that about Indian philosophy, about Hindu philosophy, about metaphysics, Hindu metaphysics, about how, it combines things like para, apara, prakriti, in a very deep philosophical framework. It is not like religion in the sense of, Christianity or Islam. It is really like more like a total framework for making sense of things like what we today call things like, consciousness and all those kind of things, which are an important role in today's research, right? So I did not think about these things, like, these mathematical things at this point in time, actually. But later on, when I came to Germany for my postdoc sometime in 2012, 13, yeah, I started reading more about also Indian civilization books by Dharampal. So in his he has written a book, not written a book, he has compiled articles from British, like, scientists who wrote about, Indian science and technology. So one of them, was by John Playfair. In the late 18th century, he spoke about some astronomical tables from India. He was analyzing them, and he saw that he made an observation which really shook me. He said that the theorem known as the Pythagoras theorem is being used in the prediction of eclipses, yeah, by these Indians much before it was, enunciated by Pythagoras. This was for me like a big moment, because I could, whatever you can accuse the, Britishers of, they definitely were not Hindu nationalists, or they definitely were not, very sympathetic to the, to the Indian civilization. So if he says that, so I cannot really, yeah, it has to be taken pretty seriously, because, it's not just someone who is speaking from a very sympathetic point of view to the Indian civilization. So I started to, look at this topic in more detail, there, like, at that time, this knowledge was not so available like it is today on Twitter or on, so many websites. You had to really look into research articles. You had to look into, books and encyclopedias and all that. So I luckily had access to quite a few research articles, thanks to the, university that I was in working in at that time, and also the library and everything. So I started writing, researching a lot on this topic, and I wrote a series of articles on my blog, which ultimately I also, like, they form part of the book now. So that material has been included in the book to some extent. And so basically, these were some of the things, which made me write the book. And while writing the book, I realized that there are books on this topic, on the history of Hindu mathematics, but I saw that, they are either very technical, or they are quite like, it's difficult for the layman to understand them. So I really wanted to write a book that was rigorous, but at the same time easy enough for the layman to understand without any deep knowledge of mathematics, or without having specialized in maths, or or related fields. So these were some of the things which motivated me. And some of the other things which also was for me a huge motivation was when I think of my own story. When I think, for example, when all these concepts like Pythagoras theorem or calculus, all are, like, associated with Western people. So I had always this notion that mathematics is a Western concept. And it's really psychologically very debilitating for you as an Indian, because you get the as idea, you get the notion that, okay, we are an inferior people. All the work has been done by the West, and the West are a superior like, civilization or a people. And this is, of course, this is also partly intentional, because this is also the message that was driven home through years of colonization, or through the years of, religious yeah yeah, spread of Christianity and everything. So these are, like, things which really are quite harmful for a student. And so the student, for example, in India, when he or she thinks that all this comes from the West, calculus, or the so-called Pythagoras theorem, etc., and this person does not know at all that numbers, algebra, things like, trigonometry, combinatorics, even ideas from linguistics, and even ideas which are used today in computer science, like binary number systems, they were actually developed in the Hindu civilization. Then just imagine, the sort of belongingness a student will feel for the subject, and how much confidence the student will feel for the subject. So yeah, this was also the one of the things. And one important thing was to also, for me, while writing the book, was to show the transmission of this mathematics to the rest of the world. That yeah, this knowledge was actually taken by the, for example, by the Arabs. We call the numbers today as the Arabic numbers, but they're actually Hindu numbers. Or algebra, they also took. And today we think that algebra was developed by Al-Khwarizmi, which is actually not true. He just basically, took the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, and like, rebranded them. And so basically, these are some of the aspects that I wanted to talk about. And finally, one motivating factor for me also was, while I was researching on the book, I realized that, what made me think was, why don't we know about all this? Why is this knowledge so much hidden in the research articles? Why is it not part of the mainstream? Things like Euclid is so much part of the mainstream, Pythagoras is so much part of the mainstream, but who has heard of, Brahmagupta or Bhaskara or Aryabhatta? You just ask someone, no one, at least in Europe. Maybe some in India it will be a little bit more common, but in Europe nobody has heard of the Brahmagupta's name. Whereas, he explicitly gave the rules for, arithmetic of numbers, positive numbers, negative numbers, fractions. Just giving a small example of Brahmagupta, there are many other such cases. Fibonacci sequence, for example, everyone has heard of Fibonacci sequence, but nobody has heard of Hemachandra or Veerahanka, who these were the people who actually gave the so-called Fibonacci sequence much before Fibonacci, in the context of prosody. So these are some of the things that made me like, write the book. Like, why don't we know about all this? Why is this knowledge so suppressed in today's world? Yeah, right.
Wow. Again, that's excellent extempore, sir. Just continuing on that line of thought, I want to also ask, so our philosophy, like Hindu philosophy, the way that you mention it today, the world is trying to understand consciousness, quote unquote, the word consciousness. But the way that Hindus at least look at it, at least the Vedic traditions look at it, they look at it in the following way. I could quote a verse from Vishnu Tatparya Nirnaya written by Madhvacharya. It begins with this very nice Mangalacharana. It says Sadagamaika Vidyam Samadita Ksharaksharam Narayanam Sadavande Nirdosha Shesha Sadguna. So it claims on at the first verse of the treatise that reality is neither which can be destroyed, neither something that ksharakshram samatita ksharakshram, which is kshar means which can be destroyed, akshar means which cannot be destroyed. So reality is that, and you can only know them through something called as agamas. So now agamas, as we all know as Indians, are something that is handed down by Brahman himself, and it is not written or authored by a human being. That is the consensus, at least. And this is the civilization. This is the at least the basic ontology on top of which all the other spiritual concepts build up. So under this purview, like we talk about these fancy notions of spirituality and something that is atindriya, which is beyond the sense perceptions and all of this. And at least Aryabhata or all the names that you mentioned, all of these people were Vedic people. Some of them, at least most of them, were Vedic people, Brahmagupta including Bhaskaracharya. So why would these people who were heavily invested in the search of something metaphysical or something that is even, in search of a Brahman or in today's terminology, the consciousness, why were they now interested suddenly in developing machinery or the tools or at least the abstract notions of mathematics and numbers, which has nothing to do with these things? Or does it have some sort of relationship where the two can be seen together?
Yeah. So so I think so first of all, so there is of course a very profound point, like the profound importance of numbers, or or if you look at the works of the linguists, like um, the like Panini, or Pingala, they take so much effort in enumerating this different chandas and creating and writing the rules for the vyakarana, or grammar or linguistics. So there and yeah, and so, like, the language plays definitely a huge role in this. But unfortunately, I don't I would not be, like, so much qualified to go into this topic further. But what I would definitely say that, so for example, uh, like, the question, like, they were heavily invested with the metaphysical, why did they need to develop the mathematics part of it? uh, I think the whole point is that, like, being involved with the metaphysical, so to speak, is not really, does not mean that, the material world is excluded. So in the Hindu civilization, in the Hindu knowledge framework, there is this concept of para and apara prakriti, as I have mentioned also in my book in detail. So apara prakriti is the, like, the physical world. Everything that is changing or that can be observed would be the apara prakriti. So the physical matter, then even things like the ego, or your emotions, and these kind of things, and emotions. Yeah. So everything that is changing, and you would be like mind, for example, even mind, this all form part of the apara. But whereas the para is something, which is like the observer, which is unchanging, the unchanging reality. So as a consequence, there was also this para vidya and apara vidya. And what is also, um, what's important is that, the apara vidya is not considered to be a stumbling block for para vidya. So in fact, apara prakriti is a problem only when you get, involved with it mentally, so you lose sight of the bigger picture of the para prakriti when you get, like, very much attached to the material world, or whatever, the things like that. So whereas the the fact is that, if you want to live in the material world, you also need to act in the material world, which means that you need to have a knowledge of the material world. And so the knowledge of the apara vidya is definitely, like, important in this case. The other aspect is that, this distinction between para and apara prakriti, it's also given other names in the Sanskrit terminology, like kshara akshara, as you just mentioned, or prakriti and purusha, or sharir and shariri, or kshetra and kshetragya, in the 13th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, for example. So this distinction is there at an initial level of understanding, but at a deeper level of understanding, like I can, for example, here show you some verses. At a deeper level of understanding, this distinction is actually not there, because the supreme truth can be said to be neither true or untrue. So for example, uh, and also, like, in the Bhagavad Gita, there is a phrase called the Sadasa Chaham Arjuna. That is, that I am truth as well as untruth, being as well as non-being. So tapam yaham aham varsham nigrihnami utsrijami cha amritam chaiva mrityuscha sadasa chaham Arjuna. So this is, for example, this is one of the verses that says about talks about this. Or you can also have, from the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, yeyam yat tat pravakshyami yaj gyatva amritam ashnute anadi matparam brahma na satta nasa duchyate. So it can be said to be neither true nor untrue. So, and in this sense, it means that the apara prakriti is also a prakriti of the supreme being, the Bhagwan himself, right? So it is also every bit as worthy to be respected and to be revered as the para prakriti. So so in this sense, this distinction is actually, disappears when you go at a little bit higher advanced level of understanding. So I think these are some of the aspects that what's also important is that, it's in the way that the Hindu civilization, conceives of God, or the supreme being. God is actually maybe a wrong word, because it's more like, a Western word in the religious sense. But yeah, so like, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita, you have verses like, um, sarvabhutasthamatmanam sarvabhutani chatmani ikshate yoga yuktatma sarvatra samadarshana. Like, the person who sees all beings in the Brahman, and the Brahman in all beings, he sees correctly. Or you can have something like, from the Bhagavad Gita, yo mam pashyati sarvatra sarvam cha mayi pashyati tasyaham na pranashyami sa cha me na pranashyati. That everything is, who sees in me, and me in everything. So again, when you look at these verses, you see that this distinction between apara and para prakriti, they disappear. So it's like, they get unified. This is not the case in Christianity or in Islam, where you have the material world on the one hand, and you have God somewhere out there in the other hand, who has nothing to do with this material world, right? And this material world actually then turns out to be some resources for the people to enjoy, for the true believers, for example, to enjoy. Whereas in the Hindu civilization, this apara prakriti is something which you should not get, emotionally attached with, be it money, or be it, like, relations, or human beings, in the sense of, yeah, uh, yeah, kam krodh lobh sort of thing, right? uh, One should not get involved with the apara prakriti in this sense, and also one should not, think of the apara prakriti as resources to be exploited. Yeah, so I think these are some of the aspects. I'm not sure if I was able to, express the points
Yes.
here as
So
well as I
if I
wanted
was
to.
to summarize your
Yeah.
notion of uniting the two, so we can go back to Uddalaka and his son Shvetaketu and his disciple Yajnavalkya. So Yajnavalkya ultimately gives a nice treatise on how the entire universe is idealistic. So the truth is unmanifest, and everything that exists as truth is beyond the sense perception. So basically, the idealist version of the universe, that is also what nowadays physics is coming close to, if I'm not wrong. And now, what can be more idealistic than mathematics, right? You literally conjure ideas out of thin air, and you create concepts, very fancy concepts, that end up, I don't know, running this phone, for example, or making this interaction possible over the internet. So in that way, it's very nice, the way that you explain all of this, and unifying the para and the apara prakriti, which is known and the unknown. All of this it ultimately comes down from the same source, if I'm not
Yes,
wrong.
I also want to here just, mention just one point, because of this, like a pretty sophisticated framework of Hindu metaphysics, and how, the supreme reality is, conceived of, together with the, material world. it allowed the mathematics in the Indian civilization to proceed along pretty sophisticated ways, which was not followed in the West. So, for example, the development of the zero, the concept of numbers, especially negative numbers, then the concept of algebra using symbols to denote unknowns. These are all really very abstract notions, and in fact, even in algebra, there is a very deep connection with the vyakta and the avyakta of Hindu philosophy. So these are things which really took time to develop in the West. So the West could not accept zero for a very long time. The Arabs, they did not, they totally avoided the use of negative numbers. They totally avoided the use of symbols. At least Al-Khwarizmi, the supposed father of algebra, he has not used a single symbol in his book on algebra. So yeah, so these are some of, and also, like, the Greeks, the Arabs, they had a predominantly geometric way of looking at problems. So numbers were for them things like area and length. So whereas in
Okay.
India, even geometric problems were converted to algebraic problems, and then you have this pretty sophisticated ideas here.
Since we are on the subject of algebra and numbers and using symbols to represent numbers and notions of all these problems, I want to ask you also another question, right? So you mentioned zero as a concept, which took a lot of time, and this vyakta bhava, which comes directly from the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which we have extensively covered in another podcast. Uh, I want to ask you again. It's going back to the book, right? So you have, do I hold it? Yeah. So imperishable seed. You have the word imperishable seed. Can you maybe tell us what does it mean? I mean, why did you use this word to talk about mathematics? Because what does imperishable mean, and what does the seed represent in the context of mathematics?
Yes, so this is closely related to what we had just been discussing, before this on algebra and symbols. So, so in the in the Hindu mathematical framework, so you have, that arithmetic number systems, etc. They developed in the Indian civilization in the Hindu mathematical framework. Similarly, algebra also developed here. So now the Hindu word, Sanskrit word for these two branches is Vyakta Ganita and Avyakta Ganita. So vyakta is like, the physical, material, concrete things which you see. So for example, numbers, the number 4, for example, is an example of vyakta. It is there. But if you use a symbol, which for an unknown, that is the avyakta. So for example, that in a right angle triangle, a square plus b square equal to c square, c being the hypotenuse. So this you can think of the avyakta, whereas if you consider 3, 4 and 5, this is the vyakta, 3 square plus 4 square equal to 5 square. So it's like, from the avyakta, all the vyakta comes. So this is exactly, the notion also, one of the points mentioned also in the Bhagavad Gita at several places, that from avyakta vyaktayah, it like, that's, I don't exactly remember the phrase, right, the shloka right now, but from the avyakta comes avyakta. It's somewhere in the 8th chapter. Then then so in this sense, the avyakta can be thought of as a seed, the seed which gives birth, which gives rise to, the entire creation. And normally a seed, once a tree comes from it, it gets destroyed. But this is a very really, different kind of seed, in which that, even when the things are created, the seed itself is not destroyed. So it's an imperishable seed. And this seed is also called, as like in the Bhagavad Gita, as bijam avyayam. So this phrase bijam avyayam is the, the origin of the title, the imperishable seed of my book. And Bhaskara too, in the 12th century, he speaks about, algebra and arithmetic, and he makes exactly the same comparison between arithmetic and algebra, as between Vyakta and the Avyakta. So his shloka, where he describes this, you can read into it like a double meaning. On the one hand, it is, a glorification of the, the Brahman, the Paramatman, or or the Bhagwan, from which the entire universe comes. And on the other hand, it's also a description of how from Vyakta Ganita, the Avyakta Ganita comes. So I have actually his verse here. I can just read it out to you. It's
Yes,
from his
please.
Bija Ganita, from the Siddhanta Shiromani. He says, उत्पादकं यत् प्रवदन्ति बुद्धेः अधिष्ठितं सत्पुरुषेण सांख्याः व्यक्तस्य कृत्स्नस्य तदेक बीजम् अव्यक्तम ईशम गणितम च वन्दे. So one day I bow down to that avyakta, who is the cause of the entire universe, and also to that avyakta ganita, which is the, which gives rise to the vyakta ganita, to the arithmetic. So this was the reason behind this title.
That was a fantastic explanation, sir. I mean, now it all makes sense. So, I would urge every viewer to go right now online and buy this book, The Imperishable Seed, and read it. It was published by Garuda Publications, uh, and yeah, this is a fantastic book. So, moving on. So we have talked about now a little bit of algebra, a little bit of philosophical foundations of mathematics, and all of that. Now let us come to the actual concrete developments that happened in the Hindu civilization, where all of these notions came about. Right? Now, just can you tell us the main sort of components or the branches of mathematics that developed and flourished here before the onslaught of Islamic imperialism, or maybe Christian persecution, etc.
Yeah, this is. I will of course have to give a very short summary here. Maybe we can take up the individual aspects in some of the upcoming podcasts, right? So if you just start from the beginning, one of the earliest things that comes to one of the earliest things that comes to my mind is the so-called Pythagoras theorem. So Pythagoras supposedly discovered it or proved it, but actually there is no evidence that he did so, and there is no evidence that he proved it. In fact, the first known general enunciation of this principle comes from the Sulba Sutras, which is at least 800 BCE. This is actually a really conservative estimate, so I'm just making it clear that it's a very conservative estimate. So when one says 800 BCE, but that's even that conservative estimate is much before Pythagoras. Then that comes from the Bodhayana Sulba Sutra and the Apastamba Katyayana Sulba Sutras. From the Sulba Sutras, so these were manuals for creating Vedic altars. So they give geometrical rules. So they were not books on mathematics, but they were yeah, for creating rules for creating geometric Vedic altars. Then you have, of course, the whole number system, like the development of zero, the whole idea of negative numbers, fractions, ideas like square roots, cube roots, all the different algorithms for carrying out the basic arithmetic operations, multiplication, division, subtraction, and addition, and of course cube roots and square roots, all these operations. Then you have connected with the concept of arithmetic is the concept of algebra, like we had just been discussing some time back. The use of symbols. Today we use x, y, z. So the Hindu mathematicians were they used symbols, and as far as I know, they are the first ones in the world to have made use of symbols. In such a detailed and exhaustive way. Brahmagupta and Bhaskaravan, and this whole group of scholars in India. Then in actually most of the mathematics that we learn in school today comes from India. So if you take trigonometry is such an important subject of mathematics. The ideas of sine, cosine, they even the concept of sine and cosine, they originated from India. So this sine, as we take this half chord, as we take of the in a circle, that originates from Aryabhata's that's in Aryabhata's innovation. Then all the formulas we learn in trigonometry, the sine and cosine addition formulas. Sine of a plus b is sine a cos b plus cos a sine b, for example. That comes from the Hindu civilization. Then you have ideas of linguistics. You have chanda shastra, that no the Ashtadhyayi from Panini. This he lived, again, a very conservative estimate is he lived in about 500 BCE, but again it's a very conservative estimate. It is actually most probably quite before that, but nonetheless. So ideas in, even like even though it's such an ancient knowledge, it has applications today even to fields like computer science. So for example, the Backus Naur form that is used in computer science is was developed by him. And then you have the development of prosody, that is chandas, metrical rhythmic meters, for shlokas. So people like Pingala in his Chanda Sutra, and a whole stream of other scholars after him, including several Jain scholars. like Hemachandra, they did great work in this. So Pingala, he described those numbers which we today call as binary systems for keeping track of the different poetic meters and the indexes between them. The so-called Fibonacci sequence comes also from from the works of Hemachandra Virahanka, much before Fibonacci, of course. Then the idea of Meru Prastara, which is today erroneously called as Pascal's triangle, a very interesting concept. Also, was described by Pingala, 500 BC or so. Hemachandra Virahanka, they were like later, like ninth, 10th century AD, 9th, 10th century CE in this. Then you have the whole topic of combinatorics, permutations and combinations. Mahavira, this Jain mathematician from the ninth century, he gave the formula for combinations. Bhaskara too, in his Leelavati, he gave a lot of different formulas for combinations, permutations. And Leelavati, I must emphasize that it's it's a training book. It's not more like a research book, but it's a training book for students. So it's a pretty elementary book. But he has systematically given them listed them out. Then I would come to the topic of calculus, which we think was developed by Newton and Leibniz. Like this whole myth is built around this, that oh, there was this feud between them. They developed it independently. Blah 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 blah. But what is not usually told is that this subject of calculus was in fact developed by the Kerala mathematicians in the 14th century, 14th, 15th century. Madhava, Nilakantha, Jeshtadeva, from this lineage. What is also very important to emphasize is that in Europe this calculus somehow suddenly pops up out of nowhere with the works of Galileo, and later on Cavalieri and all these people, and finally Newton and Leibniz. In a space of maybe around 200 years also, which 200 years or so, which also coincides with the the entry of the Jesuit priests to India from Europe, who were on the lookout for mathematical knowledge for calendars and navigation. What is not what's interesting is that whereas in the Hindu civilization, the development of calculus has a very long history, going at least to the times of Aryabhatta, where he gives his second order sine tables in his Aryabhatiya. So and he gives a rule for creating these sine values. Uh, uh, and if you actually read this rule, it has two interpretations. One of which is that, makes use of a result in differential calculus, and the other interpretation makes use of the so-called fundamental theorem of calculus. So obviously here I will not be able to go into details because of the shortage of time. But I have all given the entire mathematical derivation also in the book. So it's like based on the research articles of K.S. Shukla and other luminaries of Hindu mathematics researchers. Yeah, so these would be some of the aspects of the
So
Hindu mathematical tradition.
you quoted many scholars, and through this podcast we got to know how many things which were originated in India and later attributed to some XYZ other person. And you also spoke about transmission, ki how things which were developed in India, it got transmitted to some other countries, and then they published it or rebranded it as their own. You also quoted about the calculus and Kerala origination, which I believe, I hope we can create a more new podcast session for that. I hope you agree on this.
Sure, it will
So
be
this is a kind of
very nice.
invitation, this podcast. So
Thank you. Yeah.
we are already booking you for next podcast.
Thank you.
So this was a lot of learning experience. Before we end this podcast, I have a question, sir. You spoke of all this. You also spoke ki, today it is not in mainstream but in research papers. So what do you think, or what are the measures which we as a student, or which we as a citizen, how can we ensure ki, of course we refer your book. Second, what can more steps we can take to bring this into mainstream, all the research which you have spoken of, and as you said ki belongingness.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. Also, it's a little bit difficult to answer because there is definitely some resistance amongst people. At least, I mean, yeah, because this whole common narrative is so widespread that when you come and tell someone like this, oh, the Fibonacci sequence is not from Fibonacci, they will of course not take it seriously and all this. But nonetheless, in the interest of the truth, it has to be, I think, done like what you guys are doing. You're talking about these things. So I think, yeah, we just have to carry on along the similar lines. I don't know what else. Like maybe Ajay, you have something to add to this?
Yes, so maybe I am a very strong believer in, telling the things as it is, yathavat. That is the whole idea of the Indian knowledge system also, understanding reality in its simplest and in its inherent nature. So also connecting to that is the reality of our history, right? So of course all of these things happened in the past to us. We were subjected to a lot of atrocities and colonial exploits. We are very well aware of these things, and there is a certain amount of animosity against these so-called Western cultures, which imposed their systems upon us, to an extent that now there is what I call a cultural amnesia among Indians, that we don't really understand what we were in the past. We have forgotten it in a sense. So talking about these things shouldn't be an attack on the prevailing, the prevailing status quo of academia, of history, of any pedagogical exercise that we do as scientists or economists or researchers. But in fact it should be seen as uh, this just getting to the truth. I mean, if there is something, there has been historical injustice that has been done, at least the least thing that you can do is you need not correct it, at least acknowledge it. That is what I would say, and that is what I would request all of the intellectuals and the researchers in power positions of power to at least try and see this, try and get into the reading mode and understand if it is true or not. Then they can all come to their own conclusions, right? If you don't have that discussion, and if you dismiss it right on the face of it by saying, oh, this is right wing populism, or this is all of this, then there's no merit to that argument. That is what I would say. And it's not being polemic. I'm not trying to attack them just by saying that, hey, Pythagoras did not prove the theorem. It actually comes way before him. So what's wrong in that? It should be accepted, it should be studied, and it should be recorded, and it should be changed also. That is my opinion
Exactly.
on
Yeah.
this.
I think it's like I think it's more like amongst the people there is this pressure to conform to the mainstream narrative, and there's a very big pressure on people because they don't want to be the odd person out. So they would rather believe in something which is based on common consensus, even though it may be false, rather than believe in some not believe but like stick to the truth and therefore risk being unfriended, so to speak. Being kicked out of the friend circle or not being taken so seriously in the friend circle. So I think this also does require a sort of some mental strength that you have to have some sort of mental strength to be able to also take it, the price so to speak, of sticking with the truth, or in truth in general, and in this case the truth regarding the Hindu civilization or the historical developments of mathematics, for example, in this specific case. So yeah.
So, thank you so much, Bhaskar sir, for joining, and thank you so much, Ajay Bhaiya, for your time. Before we conclude the podcast, I would request Ajay Bhaiya to show again the book. Viewers, you can purchase this book. It is available on all major platforms, and I request and I urge you all to buy, and please make it mainstream amongst your friend circle or your friends or family. You can buy the book on Garuda Prakashan website also. It is available on Amazon also. Thank you so much, Bhaskar sir, for your time. Thank you so much, Ajay Bhaiya, for your time. And sir, we have already requested you now in this podcast that you are reserved for future podcasts also, where we have given a lot of topics to discuss on now. So we hope to
Great. Yeah.
continue this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much
I'll
for
be happy.
joining. Yes.
Thank you very
Thank
Thank
you
much,
so
you.
much.
Vedant and
Thank
Ajay.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank
Yeah.
you, sir.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Chalo.